Folks, today we're talking about the joyous situation of martyrdom, suicide. No, it's builds up on what we've been talking about the last few weeks the last few sessions because we read about Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion, who was wrapped in a Torah and burned. That was Rabbi Meir's father-in-law. We read about Rabbi Akiva, who was combed. These are two of the 10 that were martyred in something we call the Ele Ezkara, which is a text that we read I mentioned traditionally at Yom Kippur. We also read it at Tisha B'Av traditionally as well, but it's a list of these rabbis that were murdered. It was a collection of stories, of Midrash and stories that was collected by the Middle Ages is when it was published. Actually, I'll show it to you in a second. But it wasn't from the Talmud. It takes stories from the Talmud, and then the rabbis who put it together edited them together as taking out an anthology of stories of the rabbis, the 10 rabbis who were murdered during the time. It's actually not just the time of Bar Kokhba, but primarily around the Bar Kokhba age. But it's really covering like the Roman era from about, it's almost like 100 years of persecutions, and so this is roughly the time in people's minds. You can kind of put it in your mind, a little bit before the movie Gladiator, a little bit after, from about 120 to 200. So it's during that period where Rome was definitely at its pinnacle as far as the land that it controlled, but it was also, dealing with the birth of Christianity and the situation of Judaism now being a religion of diaspora Jews, because there is no Israel homeland anymore. The Jews are living. There are some Jews living in Israel, but most Jews now, 90% of them are living outside of Israel, whether it's in Rome or Greece or Egypt. A lot of Jews were living in Egypt, Asia Minor, all across the Roman Empire. There were Jews, and at 200, when this happens, there are a lot more Jews than there are Christians, folks. There's a lot more Jews. Um, and so it doesn't change until after the Constantine, about 130 years later. What? So Jews really didn't start making their way into Eastern Europe until about 1000. And that was really when the Ashkenazi community started moving east. So the Ashkenazi community was in France and Germany about 1000. And then partly because of the persecutions of the Crusades, because the Crusades happened in around 1100, 1200, partly because of those, and partly because Poland and that area was very accommodating to Jews. They welcomed the Jews. A lot of the Jews moved from Germany and France into Poland, and what eventually, after Poland was conquered, what would become Russia and Ukraine and those areas that were part of the Russian Empire. But at the time, Poland was a somewhat powerful kingdom, and they were very accommodating to the Jews, and that's how most of our ancestors wound up in that part of the world. So it was really from east, it was from the west that they moved to the east, not coming up, from Israel or whatever, from the Middle East into Eastern Europe. They came up in through Italy and France and Germany, and then east across. But if the Jews hadn't lived in Germany, we wouldn't have Yiddish, right? So because of those several hundred years of living in Germany, the Jews took on German language and created Yiddish out of that experience. And again, as we know, there was also a Jewish community at that time in the Middle Ages that was on the rise in Spain, which became the Sephardic community. So those two communities were the biggest communities in Europe. And then, of course, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on in the Middle East, which was completely separate. And those communities were flourishing in places like Iraq and Syria and Yemen. Yeah, pretty sizable Jewish community. That's why I forget what it was at some point, but something like 10% of Italians have Jewish DNA. It's a very high percentage have it. And of course, in Spain, it's even higher. Almost every Spaniard has some Jewish Sephardic DNA. Yeah, was forced to convert and just continue to live there. So today, as we read about these other rabbis who were martyred, we're going to read about them, but then we're going to get into the bigger issue of martyrdom. And what's interesting is that a lot of the works that have kind of looked at martyrdom over the last generation or two have focused on the similarities between Jewish martyrdom and Christian martyrdom, because there are obviously points of comparison. Because at the time that Jews were being martyred by the Romans, Christians were as well, and so there was a lot of similarities. In some cases, the Romans couldn't really tell the difference. They were like, what's the difference between a Jew and a Christian? They're all babbling about stuff in the Bible. They're quoting the Bible. They seemed okay to die for God, and so they didn't really get it, because up until that time, throughout most of Europe and most of Asia and most of the known world, you got conquered. You changed your religion to whoever conquered you, and the idea that the Romans, they conquered lots of people. And once they conquered them, they either took a little bit of their religion, like they did with the Egyptians. They took a little bit of Egyptian stuff, made its way into Rome, and people were worshiping Isis in Rome. Or the Egyptians took on their religion, and there were people worshiping Jupiter in Egypt. So that's just what people did. The idea that Jews, had this first idea that, like, no, our religion goes where we go. We don't change our religion because we don't live in our country anymore. And of course, that made its way into Christianity as well, even more so. I would say the Jews invented it, and then the Christians perfected it, which was a religion that was not based on any territorial significance anymore. You didn't have to have a local temple, and that was where you worshiped your God. You could worship God anywhere, not just in that one temple. And remember, Judaism could have been like that. When the temple was in Jerusalem, people thought, well, that's where God wants us to pray. Now, remember, Judaism did exist before that. When they worshiped people's backyards, they did sacrifices. But for a long time, Judaism had been working towards centralizing the religion. And then the Romans destroyed our temple the final time. And we were like, well, what are we going to do now? And we figured out a way, obviously. And so that's what we read about here is, what does that mean when the rubber meets the road? What does that mean when somebody tells you, look, we're in charge now. Don't talk to me about your God, because your God is powerless. Couldn't save you from us. And you'll see that in the discussions here, because the Jews essentially ask the question too. You'll see it in the discussions. You'll see it in the text. The rabbis say it. They say it. They're not embarrassed to say it. They say it. So we'll take a look at that, and then we'll think. Then I want you to see that this is not about the rabbis. We're going to start off with the rabbis being martyred, because we've seen it. As I said, we saw it with Rabbi Akiva, and we saw it with Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion. And then I want to tell you that this is not just about what happened 2,000 years ago. You'll see what I'm saying. So the relevance that it has to us today, which I didn't even think about. When I thought about doing this, I didn't really think about this part. You'll see what I'm saying. So we're going to look at some of the other rabbis. As I mentioned, there's a text. Well, this is a text from the Talmud that I'm going to share in a sec. But I want to show you this text first before we do that. This is a little something that we call Ele Ezkara. And you'll see, I think there's a cover for this too. Yeah. So let me just share this up here. So this is you can download this. I mean, this is available. This is what some people read again at Yom Kippur and at Tisha B'Av. And this is it's a collection of the 10 martyrs, a collection of those stories. So you can see, and this is an Orthodox collection, but they're going to tell you. I mean, these stories have inspired Jews throughout the ages, etc. Right? But let's see what it says. Let's see what it says here. No, it doesn't say yet where how long ago it was written. But again, most of us know that these were not written. These were collection from stories in the Talmud and stories in the Midrash. So you'll see these are some of the people. Again, these are the names of the rabbis that are mentioned here. Rabbi Akiva, who you know, Rabbi Hanina ben Teradion, those two we talked about. We're going to look at a couple others, but I'm going to show them to you in the Talmud itself, not in the Elias Quran. Not because it's not, it's. I want you to see it in the text, in the original text. So I'm going to show you this story. This is the story about the martyrdom of two rabbis together, which is similar to some of the things we read about with Rabbi Akiva, whose skin was taken from his living body, right? So he could say the Shema at the very last moment. He held on until he could say the Shema in the morning. Okay? That's a very famous story. And then we read about Hanina, who was burned with the Torah. So these stories are similar in some ways, you'll see. But, bless you, they'll see some other things in here too. So one of the rabbis mentioned here, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, sounds familiar, right? He was Rabbi Hillel's great-grandson. So any of the Gamliels or any of the Hillels, they're part of that dynasty. So this was one of the leading rabbis. Shimon ben Gamliel was part of the dynasty of the Hillel family. So here's what it says. So him and the other rabbi, when Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Ishmael, who according to tradition was a priest, a high priest, they were taken out to be killed. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was sitting and wondering, and he said, "Woe are we, for we are being killed like those who violate Shabbat, worship idols, commit sexual transgressions, and murder." Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha said, "May I suggest something to you?" And Rabbi Shimon said, "Go ahead." Rabbi Ishmael said, "Perhaps you were once sitting in a meal, and some poor people came and stood at your door, and you did not allow them to come to eat. So maybe you screwed up." Rabbi Shimon said, "Heaven forbid I ever did anything like that. I had guards posted at my door, and when poor people came, they would be let in to sit and drink with me, and then bless the heavenly name with me and do Birkat Hamazon. I brought them in." So Rabbi Ishmael said, "Perhaps when you were sitting and preaching on the Temple Mount, and all of Israel were sitting before you, you became arrogant for a moment." Rabbi Shimon said, "Ishmael, my brother, a person must simply be ready to receive his punishment." So he's like, "What am I going to do? Maybe, I don't know. We're going to get punished. We're going to die." So they went and pleaded with the executioner. One said, "I'm a priest, the son of a high priest. Kill me first, so that I do not have to witness the death of my friend." Whew. Wow. That's Ishmael. He says that because he's a priest. The other said, "I am the leader of the community, the son of a former leader of the community. Kill me first, so that I do not have to witness the death of my friend." That's Shimon ben Gamliel. The executioner replied, "Let's draw lots." So they draw lots, and it fell on Rabbi Shimon. Immediately, the executioner took his sword and chopped off Rabbi Shimon's head. Rabbi Ishmael took it and held it to his chest and cried and shouted, "This holy mouth, this faithful mouth, this holy mouth, this faithful mouth, this mouth that brought forth precious jewels and gems and pearls, who has buried you in the dirt? Who has stuffed your mouth with dirt and dust?" Right? The verse from Zechariah, it says, "Arise, sword, against my shepherd, against my own beloved man." He had not finished speaking when the sword came down and chopped off his head as well. And about that, the verse from Exodus says, "My anger will rage, and I will kill them by the sword. And your wives will become widows, and your children will become orphans." I'll just finish that sentence. From the fact that it says, "I will kill them by the sword," don't I know that their wives were made widows and their children were made orphans? But they both were and were not widows, for there were no witnesses to testify that these women were permitted to marry again. This is what happened in Beitar, which is where the revolution, the Bar Kokhba revolt came to an end, where not a soul survived to testify that a woman can marry again. And the fact that it says your wives will become widows, don't I know that children will become orphans? But they both were not orphans, for their inheritance stood in their father's name, was not given to them to inherit, so they can marry and give it to their wives. So it's basically telling you that these people, even their wives couldn't remarry. Now I will tell you something. I'm going to show you right now, just so you know. That's not the only version of the story. From Elias Kara, you think that's a bad version. Well, that's not the only version of what happens to Rabbi Ishmael. There's a version of Rabbi Ishmael, and this is from the Elias Kara, that after he sees Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel killed, look at this story. When they see, it says again, first part is exactly the same. The lot fell out on Shimon ben Gamliel. Caesar commanded they be beheaded first, and he was. Rabbi Ishmael the Kohen put his body on his lap and began, there it says he put his body on his lap, right? Continue to mourn and cry for Shimon ben Gamliel. Caesar asked him, what is this all about? And again, the Caesar wasn't there, but the representative of the Caesar, the Roman authority. Who is this old man that you're crying over so much? You should rather be crying for yourself. Rabbi Ishmael answered, I'm not crying for myself because my friend was greater than me in Torah and wisdom. I'm crying because he preceded me to the heavenly yeshiva. I'm sad because he's already there. He's already in heaven. You think you ain't seen nothing yet? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, they are. They're 100% believing in heaven and hell. No, but they believed it, and they believed that, again, with all their heart, that this was there, which is why they were at odds with the Sadducees who didn't believe it. Said, show me. But they believed it 100%. 100%. Okay. The story. You think Rabbi Akiva's story is bad. This story is the worst. But people read this every Yom Kippur. Ugh. While he was still speaking, mourning, crying, and lamenting, Caesar's daughter peeked out the window. She saw the beauty of Rabbi Ishmael the Kohen Gadol, right, the priest, and her mercy was aroused. She sent a message to her father and asked him to grant her a single request. Caesar replied with a message that she could have anything she wanted apart from Rabbi Ishmael and his friends. She sent a message to her father to spare the life of Rabbi Ishmael. Caesar replied that he'd already taken an oath to kill him. I can't do it. It's already sealed. It's done. She sent him another message. If so, my request that you command them to flay the skin off his face so that I can look at it instead of in the mirror. Immediately, Caesar commanded to flay the skin from his face. When they reached the place of his tefillin on top of his forehead, Rabbi Ishmael cried a loud and bitter cry which shook the heavens and earth. He cried a second time and shook the heavenly throne. The angel said to God, should a righteous person such as this, whom you have shown all the secrets of the upper worlds and the lower worlds, be killed in such an abnormal manner? This is the Torah, and this is the reward. See, here the angels say it to God. God, you're going to let this happen? I'm telling you, it's here. The rabbi said it. The rabbis put these words in the angels' mouths. God replied, leave him so that his merit can extend for many generations. What else can I do? It has been decreed and there is nobody to annul it. A voice came out from heaven and said, if I hear any more cries, I will return the universe to chaos and emptiness. I'm going to destroy everything if this continues. God says, either this stops or I'm undoing creation. I understand, but this is over one guy. God tells him, this is the system. right? This is the system, which of course is telling all of us this is the system. So when you want to know how people make sense of the Holocaust, because we've been reading this already for 1,000 years. So some of it was based on the Talmud. You saw the first part that was based on the Talmud. We don't know who wrote necessarily this part. We don't have an author for this, but sometime between the Talmud and the first part is the same. They gets cut off. His head gets. They draw the lots. Head gets cut off. This is where it gets bizarre. This is horrible. I mean, this is Cronenberg or this is some scary stuff. So when Rabbi Ishmael heard this, he remained quiet. Caesar asked him, "Why were you not crying and screaming until they reached this place?" He replied, "I'm not crying for my soul, but rather because of the mitzvah tefillin, which you're taking away from me." Caesar asked, "Do you still have faith in your God?" He replied, "Even if you kill me, I will not lose my faith." Immediately the soul of Rabbi Ishmael departed and left his body. And then the next part goes to Rabbi Akiva. Yeah. So this section, part of it I showed you, it was on Avot de Rabbi Natan. So part of it was from the Talmud, and then part of it was written afterwards. We don't know. We don't know. Sometime between then and 1,000 years ago. It's been like this for 1,000 years. Jews have been reading this every Yom Kippur for 1,000 years. Okay? And then it goes to Akiva, and then it goes to Rabbi Hanina ben Teradyon, and then. So the story, obviously, I mean, it's horrific. I don't know, like, how old is a kid when they have to hear that story? I'm not joking. Like, how old does a kid have to be to hear that story? It's Silence of the Lambs stuff. Yeah. So look, part of it's based on fact because Romans did horrible things like that, and part of it's based on nightmare, like a nightmare scenario. You're going to take the nightmare. We're going to take it to a conclusion that's going to drive you nuts. So let's take a look. That's the part of the Elias Kara. Now I'm going to show you another section about one of the other guys that's mentioned, which is this guy named Chutzpit, the interpreter. This is back to the Talmud, exactly. This is back to the section called Kiddushin, which is about marriage, ostensibly. But of course, it's about lots of other things. And I want to show you something that we read before. For those who were been here the last few weeks, a couple weeks ago, we read about Acher, about Elisha ben Abuya, the guy who jumped to the other side. We don't know what side, but it's a side that wasn't our side, the dark side. We just call him Acher, the other. Rav Yosef said, had Acher, literally the other, the appellation of the former sage Elisha ben Abuya, interpreted this aforementioned verse, that it may go well with you, from Deuteronomy, homiletically is referring to the world to come, as did Rabbi Yaakov, the son of his daughter. He would not have sinned. So, I mean, this is all about interpreting a word, but look, the Gemara says, what to sin? What made him go to the other side? What made him become Acher? There are those who say he saw a case like this, where a son went up to the roof on his father's command, dispatched the mother bird, and then died. Well, that's the line from Deuteronomy, right? That's the line in Deuteronomy that says, honor your father and mother that you may long endure. God is, that God is assigning to you. It's from the Ten Commandments, right? So, he also sees that God promises these things and doesn't come. It doesn't come like this, right? He sees somebody then doing what the Torah says, which is saving the mother bird and, doing what his father said. Hey, you know what the Torah says, and the guy does it, and then he falls. He dies. He went up, he saved the bird, and then he fell, and he died. And Elisha ben Abuya goes, where are you talking? I mean, the implication is, he says, guy's doing a mitzvah, and he dies. So he says the system's broken, it doesn't work. But that's not the only possibility. And there are those who say he saw the tongue of Hutzpit, the disseminator, after the latter was executed by the government. He is one of the 10, Hutzpit. Hutzpit literally is called ha-mitorgamon. That is the Mitorgamon was the person who was the interpreter or the translator. He was the guy who translated the stuff from Hebrew to Aramaic. So he was the translator. They had a translator in the room who translate. So he was known because of his linguistic abilities. He is executed by the government, and what did the government do? They not only killed him, they threw his tongue out into the street after they executed him, and it was dragged along by something else, which, again, they say it's a euphemism for a pig, maybe it was a dog, some animal had his tongue in its mouth. And that image in Acher's mind drove him nuts. He said, shall a mouth that produced pearls lap up dirt? For this reason he went out and sinned. He left. Nefakhat, he went off. He went off the reservation. So he sees the guy who's known for his aura, you know, it's not just the guy was known for his translation, for his ability to translate and to speak and now he sees his tongue in a pig's mouth, and he just drives him crazy. He says, I can't comprehend a world like this. He says, I'm done. I'm out. So the Chutzpit story is, it's another one of those stories. I mean, I can show you the story in Elias Quran. It's also in the Talmud. It's not a very descriptive story like the other ones we read, but he's murdered and his tongue is taken out. His tongue is thrown out. Let's just see if there's any. No. Um, the rest of the discussion is just about whether we do mitzvot for the sake of being rewarded, which of course is an interesting discussion. But I want you to see that this is another example of the problem of martyrdom from the standpoint of what does it do to the community, and not just the community, but the leaders of the community. Because at least in the case of this guy, of Elisha ben Abuya, who we now know as Acher, no one calls him Elisha ben Abuya, everyone calls him Acher, the other, he couldn't take it anymore. So keep that in mind. Yeah, the rabbis remember these martyrs, and as we said, Rabbi Ishmael, Rabbi Shimon say, we're going to be, this is, we'll give up our lives for God. We'll give up our lives for tradition. But there are other rabbis who they just can't wrap their heads around it. So it's not like every rabbi can get this and even understand it, let alone are willing to die. The whole system comes, is called into question by this. So it's not so simple. That's what I'm trying to tell you. It's not like this is celebrated and there's no consequences for it. There's a consequence for it. This great rabbi went crazy. And he was a great rabbi. He was continued to be Rabbi Meir's teacher, even though he couldn't be a Jew anymore, or couldn't be a whatever. I mean, he couldn't be in the community anymore. He had a student who still admired him and still wanted to be near him, which I think is an amazing story of what happens when your teacher does something really bad. It happens. It happens to people sometimes. So there's that story. There's that story of Chutzpit, one of the other 10. Now I'm going to show you what happens when the average ordinary, not rabbi, decides to do something, I was going to say noble, we call noble death. But we have stories in the Talmud of people who were not rabbis who were also martyred. And here's one of the most famous ones. So famous that for a while it was actually a holiday. There was a holiday called Trajan's Day. It's called in Hebrew Turionus. Turionus. There was a day called Trajan's Day. What was Trajan's Day? Trajan was the Roman emperor just before Hadrian. So just before the period of the Bar Kokhba revolt. During that time, because Hadrian was the emperor during the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Judeans saw this time as there was kind of a civil war going on in Rome, and they saw this as an opportunity to revolt. It's the same reason why the rebellion started. We've talked about this. Why the rebellion started in 66 in the land of Israel was because there was a vacuum in Rome. There was what they called the Year of the Four Emperors, where there were four people that were fighting for control of Rome. The one who destroyed Jerusalem, Vespasian, is the one who became emperor. It's not a coincidence. This tremendous victory he had over the rebels in Judea led to his being crowned or consolidating and being able to consolidate the power. Remember, he went back to Rome during that war. War wasn't over when he went back. He saw the opportunity. He had already, the war was almost over. He had already raided the land. He had stolen, he had raped and pillaged and taken all the resources out of Judea by that time. He had enough to go back to Rome and buy the rest of the Senate and buy the rest of the people that he needed. But he left his son Titus in charge of the putting down the rest of the revolt for the last year and a half of the revolt. He left his son in charge, Titus, who became the next emperor. But Vespasian took the power and he went back and he killed the rest of his rivals and he became the emperor. But that's why the Jews did it. It wasn't random. They said one day, hey, let's have a revolt against Rome. They said, look, Rome's in disarray. They're not going to be able to figure it out. And it was not a bad gamble from the standpoint if it hadn't been Vespasian, who happened to have been the general in charge of putting down the rebellion and him needing a big win, who knows what would have happened. It could have been a very different history. Jerusalem may never have been destroyed. If Vespasian wasn't a great general and if he hadn't been the one there, who knows what would have happened. But it happened. Anyways, a few generations later, we have another, Vespasian's family eventually, every family in Rome eventually implodes. So his family imploded, and then there was another family that took over, and then you have this Nerva Trajan dynasty, and then that comes to an end with Hadrian, and Hadrian takes power. So we have the story of what happened during this time. And it's a story. So this is like 120, 130, right up to 130. What is Trajan Day? And this is a story that when Trajan sought to kill the important leaders Lulianus and his brother Papas in Laodicea. You can see Lulianus and Papas have very Greek names. They're Jewish, but they have very Greek names. Lulianus and Papas. So we have different versions of this story too, by the way. We have different stories of these two guys. But in this version, they explain why they have this day of remembering them. And it doesn't, again, all those stories kind of come together to put together like a picture of who these guys were, but we're not exactly sure who they were, other than they were not rabbis. So they were two community leaders, let's say. And so Trajan, the emperor, and again, probably wasn't Trajan, it was probably a representative of Rome, but it was during Trajan's rule. They say to the Romans say to him, if you are from the nation of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who are the young men who were put into the oven during the furnace during the time of Daniel in Nebuchadnezzar's day, right? So he says, if you're from that nation, the Romans say, let your God come and save you from my hand just as he saved Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. So again, here's the rabbis asking the question, why doesn't God do miracles for us now? Now, the stories from Daniel are like the last miracles in the Bible. They're the last time we see God actively doing miracles. And again, those miracles were done for us in Babylonia, in the capital, right? In you know, in the Babylonian court. But it's a fair question. And of course, the rabbis are saying that, the Romans are saying it too, like they know our stories, right? Well, okay, whatever. It doesn't matter. We have this story. The story is for us. And so they ask the question, okay, let's see what God does for you guys. Right? Everybody got this? Lulianus and Papa said to him, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were full-fledged righteous people, and they were worthy that a miracle should be performed for them. And Nebuchadnezzar was a legitimate king who rose to power through his merit, and it is fitting that a miracle be performed through him. Well, the Bible says Nebuchadnezzar was chosen by God to destroy the temple. So, that's what the Torah says. That's what Jeremiah said. The Bible says that. So they say to Trajan, but this wicked man, you, right, Trajan, is a commoner, not a real king, and is not fitting that a miracle be performed through him. So he says, we don't deserve it, and you don't deserve it. You're not legitimate. You're nothing. So you're not going to get any miracle. You're just you're a commoner. You don't get a miracle, and I'm not going to get a miracle. I'm not that good. Lulianus and Papas continued. We are not wholly righteous and have been condemned to destruction by the Omnipresent for our sins. And if you did not kill us, the Omnipresent has many other executioners. And if men do not kill us, the Omnipresent has many bears in his world that can hurt us and kill us. There's a lot of ways to die, my friend. Instead, the Holy One, blessed be he, placed us in your hands only so that he will avenge our blood in the future. I want you to sit with that right there. I want you to hear that line, pocket it, put it in your mind right now. Again, this is from the Talmud, folks. So that God will avenge our blood in the future. That I'm going to tell you I'm giving it away right now. That's the punchline. And when I say punchline, I literally mean punchline. This is the divine punchline. Remember that line, okay? Please. That God will avenge our blood in the future. Whew. Wow. Even so, Trajan remained unmoved by their response and killed them immediately. It is said that he had not moved from the place of execution when two officials arrived from Rome with permission to remove Trajan from power, and they split his skull with clubs. And so this was viewed as a divine act, as divine retribution. It was avenging their blood. And that's how it became a holiday, the day that Trajan was killed. Again, this is from a text that's about Ta'anit, about fast days and about holidays. It's actually kind of about Ta'anit Esther, the fast of Esther, which is today. A little secret. The fast starts tonight. Just started. I'll see. I am right now. I'll see how I do tomorrow. I'm very tired. So there's a lot of fasts in the Bible that are not necessarily spoken of completely in the Bible, though they're mentioned in the prophets, but by the Talmudic time. So this Ta'anit is all about fasts and holidays and things like that. So this is, again, it's about that, but we get a little story about Lulianus and Papas. Okay, these guys, not rabbis, maybe civic leaders. That's the story. But remember the avenging art. All right. Any questions, comments from anybody out there? So now we're going to read another section right here. This one's a little longer, and it's a little bit more famous. You might have heard this one before. And this one is from the Talmud, from the section called Gittin, which is about gets. It's about, like, Kiddushin is about weddings. This is about divorces. But it's got a long section here in Gittin about the destruction of the temple. It's got a long section here about the destruction of Jerusalem. And we're going to come back to it in the coming weeks. We're going to read some other sections from Gittin, from this long section. It's really interesting. But what's interesting about this story that we're going to read is that this is a story that we actually have another version of in the Apocrypha. Well, not our Apocrypha, because it's the Christians' books, but in the book of the Maccabees. We have a version of this story in the books of the Maccabees, which we didn't really know because we didn't keep the books of the Maccabees. The Christians did, the Catholic Church did. But when we started kind of, looking at the traditions in different ways, when we started working with Christians more in the last century, we started looking at our books. We started looking at our books. Hey, that's our book. Thank you for keeping it. Let's take a look at that, and let's compare it to Josephus, and let's compare it to the Talmud, and let's see if there's some interesting things that we can learn about from our book. So, look, it's not that the Jews didn't know the book of the Maccabees was out there. They did. But the tradition was not to really look at books that were not part of the holy books. If they were not part of the holy books, a lot of rabbis just wouldn't read them. The whole concept of somebody approaching it from kind of like a academia, from like a professor, like a historian, never occurred to us. The first Jewish historians didn't exist until the 1800s. There was nobody who sat down and wrote a Jewish history per se. It never happened until Heinrich Gratz in the 1800s. No one ever did it. No one ever sat down and said, let's just do a Jewish history. There were some rabbis who were a little bit more interested in history, right? And so they tried to keep lists of the leaders of the Persian Jewish community, the exilarchs. So there are people who we have a little bit of it, but the intention was never really there. But thankfully, again, we've done it in the last couple centuries. So let's take a look at this story. And you might have heard versions of this story because it's in the book of the Maccabees. And, I don't know. I heard this story when I was a little kid. I don't know why, but somebody told me this story. I don't know if my mom read it to me. I don't know where she would have gotten it. Oh, no. The first part of it, I definitely didn't learn until I was probably a teenager. There's two stories we're reading here. The first one, as I said, is less known, and as I said, this one is not usually told to kids, at least not kids that I know. The second part is, even though it's very tragic too, this one you'll see why we don't teach this to kids. It's too hard to wrap your head around. So this is the first part, but I want you to see it. Because I want you to see what the mentality of it was, and we'll talk about it. It's not a very long story. So this is during the Roman persecutions, and Rav Yehuda says, and that Shmuel says, and some say it was Rabbi Ami who says, and some say it was just taught in a Baraita, in one of these texts, right, one of these Mishnaic time texts. There was an incident involving 400 boys and girls who were taken as captives for the purpose of prostitution. These children sensed on their own what they were expected to do. And they said, if we commit suicide and drown in the sea, we will come to eternal life in the world to come. The oldest child among them expounded the verse, the Lord said, I will bring back from Bashan, I will bring back from the depths of the sea, which is from Psalms. I'll bring back from Bashan, that is, from between the teeth, Ben Shane, of the lion, and I will bring them back from the depths of the sea, is referring to those who drown in the sea for the sake of heaven. So he did a little midrash. He expounded that when God says that, I will redeem, I will bring back, I will return from the sea, that means God is going to take people who drown and bring them back to life, bring them to the eternal, to eternal life, right? When the girls heard this, they all leapt and fell into the sea. The boys then drew an a fortiori, or what we call a kal v'chomer, from the easiest to the harder, right? So they say, well, if this case is the easy case, then in the hard case must be the case. If it's going to be in that case, it's definitely going to be in that case. That's what the a fortiori, it's a kal v'chomer, we call it. The boys said, with regard to themselves, they said, if these girls, for whom sexual intercourse with men is their natural way, act in such a manner, then we, for whom sexual intercourse with men is not our natural way, should we all the more so conduct ourselves likewise? And they too leapt into the sea. Concerning them and others like them, the verse says, as for your sake, we are killed all the day long. We are reckoned as sheep for the slaughter, which is a line from Psalms. So here's a story of mass suicide. Now, we don't know where this took place. We don't know, what area they were in of the Mediterranean. And the story doesn't name names, and it doesn't have a lot of detail. But we thought Josephus' story of Masada was made up until we found Masada, and we found the actual pieces of ostraca with the potsherds with people's names on it, that we knew for a fact that this actually happened. Now look, there are parts of the story of Masada that were embellished because, Josephus has a 2-page speech that Eliezer ben Yair gives. He wasn't there to hear it. Couldn't have heard it, but he imagined it. He made a speech. He wrote it just the same way that people do historical fiction today. They don't know exactly what John Adams said, but they let Paul Giamatti give speeches, and they had a couple things that John Adams said, and they embellished it. We do it all the time. So Josephus did. We don't have exactly this version in Josephus, but we have lots of other tales in Josephus of mass suicides. So this one is, hundreds and hundreds of Jewish boys and girls that committed suicide. Now look, there's a couple things in there that are interesting from the standpoint of sexuality as well, right? So, you can say that the story isn't politically correct, but what's interesting about the story, I think, from a standpoint of like historical context and understanding what actually happens here, is the rabbis, or the story as it stands, actually gives tremendous credit to the women who take leadership in this horrible act of suicide. But they basically say, oh, look, the women are actually leading the way in this. And to some extent, women's lives are not always so good when it comes to sex anyways, because some of these women could have been married off to people that they didn't even want to be married to, right? So, let's face it. But look what they did. And so they're really, really heroic. Look, it's difficult for many reasons to read this and not, just be heartbroken over this. But there are stories about people who did similar things during the Holocaust. So this isn't fantasy, unfortunately. There's a version of this story that exists in Holocaust narrative of Jewish women who committed suicide rather than winding up being sexually humiliated, a couple generations ago. So this isn't fantasy. This is, unfortunately, too many times in Jewish history where these were the choices. The story is obviously written in shorthand because it's the Talmud. There's lots of words in here that are not there. Sexual intercourse isn't there. It never says the word sexual intercourse. It uses the word natural way, and it says, it says it does say for the sake of prostitution, but it doesn't, it doesn't say, it's not explicit really. It doesn't say the men are going to be raped, right? It doesn't say that, but it's very clear what they're talking about in that way. They're going to be using a lot of euphemisms, but everybody knows what it means. It's not a question of what it means. We know that's what it means. So this mass suicide is done by people who are not leaders. These are not rabbis. They're not even maybe fully adult. The word that's used is boys and girls. Yeladim, yeladot. So, yeah, it's a dramatic story. Like I said, I don't remember how old I was when I read this, but it's a nightmare. So if it's not a fantasy, right? It's not a fantasy. It's not that it had to be made up, but it's a nightmare. So we don't know how many thousands of Jews were taken prisoner by the Romans, but it was in the thousands, in the hundreds of thousands. So that's why there's Jewish DNA all over Italy and all over Europe. No. Yeah, where did they find it? It and oh no, it's so John's just saying they just found a mikvah in Rome. So yeah, we know that there was a huge Jewish community in Rome. The Romans talked about it. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, there's a tradition that Nero converted to Judaism, or people in his family converted to Judaism. The Christians have stories that they become Christian, but it's more likely because Christianity was so new at the time. I mean, it would have been almost impossible for them to be Christian, but they could have been Jewish. And yeah, it's there were people who converted to Judaism in Rome. We know that, but at the same time, this stuff is happening. That Jews are being taken into sexual. Thank you. They were taken into sexual slavery, and again, more people have written about it lately as they've kind of looked at sources that are more available to us today. Here's the story. I'll just pop it up here for everybody that John was talking about. Yeah, I had no idea. There you go. Thanks, John. Yeah, Jewish life in ancient Rome. So here it says, found this mikvah, the oldest such discovery outside of Israel. Yep. There you go. Look at that. It says, wow, I was there. I made my wife go there. Yeah, I see. That's where I'm, insane. As I made my wife walk around Ostia Antica. It's outside of Rome. It was the port of Rome, and there was a synagogue there. I mean, I found there at the time when I was there, 10 years, no, more like 15 years ago. They you could see like they had an area where they had excavated some of the synagogue. They had like the um, they had like the outline of where the synagogue was. So they knew, like, I guess this is no, that's the Temple of Jupiter. Anyways, they have pillars. They said this is see if there's a picture of it. They have pillars where you can see them in the background. There's like kind of an outline of it. But yeah, anywhere there's a anywhere there's a synagogue in the ancient world, I will be there. I will be there to see whatever piece of whatever is sticking out of the ground. But Ostia is a fascinating city because it was the port of Rome. It was where literally, if you were coming into Rome from Israel or from Greece or from Spain, it was the first thing you saw. So like in the movie, actually they showed it in the Gladiator 2, by the way, just so you know, because I finally saw Gladiator 2 on the way back on the plane. But they show Ostia. They show the people sailing into Ostia, because for most people that was the first glimpse that they got of Rome, the glory of Rome, and that was so they didn't see the Colosseum right away. You have to go by horse, whatever, or walk from Ostia. So, but Ostia is like ruins now. There's nothing there. Ostia Antica. I mean, there's an Ostia city that's not the ruins, but yeah, like I said, I make my wife do crazy stuff when we travel. But I think my kids were there too. So yeah, we don't know how many of these kids were brought back to Rome that didn't jump off a boat, and what happened to them. How long did it take for them to become free, if ever? Did some of them definitely would have achieved their freedom, and then they would have become, maybe some of them would still have been Jewish, and some of them forgot where they came from. But it's an interesting thing to kind of speculate. What was the life like for these people when they made their way from Judea to their new home halfway across the world. And how many times, like I said, how many times did that happen? How many times did people wind up, with the new existence? Let me just let me just see if I can see a picture of Ostia Antico, the synagogue, if I have it. Now, I lost a lot of my pictures from the. I lost a lot of my pictures from that 2007, 2008. It was actually 17 years ago that I was there. So somewhere there's a picture, but it's okay. Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you, John, for sharing that. So, but that's not the end of the story, because um, let's read about um, this. Um, Again, we're gonna. Oops, I went back a little too far. So, the next story, the story that we're going to finish with tonight, or the last Talmudic story we're gonna read. um, Rav Yehuda said, um, that verse that we just read, we were killed all day long, actually refers not to that story, but to the woman and her 7 sons who died as martyrs for the sake of the sanctification of God's name. The incident, and again, I told you, this story is the one that we have a version of in the book of Maccabees. They brought in the first of the woman's sons before the emperor and said to him, "Worship this idol." He said to the Romans, "I cannot do so. As it is written in the Torah, I am the Lord your God." It's right there in the 10 Commandments, right? They immediately took him out and killed him. Now, in the book of Maccabees, we actually get her name. It's Hannah. And in the story, it's called Hannah and her 7 sons. Here, in this version of the Talmud, we don't get her name. But we do get, this first son quotes the Torah from the 10 Commandments. Then they brought in another son before the emperor and said to him, "Worship the idol." And he said to them, "I cannot do so, as it is written in the Torah," and literally in the next verse, "You shall have no other gods besides me." And they took him out and killed him. They then brought in yet another son before the emperor and said to him, "Worship the idol." And he said to them, "I cannot do so, as it is written in the Torah, he that sacrifices to any god save the Lord only, he shall utterly be destroyed." It's from 2 chapters later, Mishpatim. So they took him out and killed him. That's 3 now. And they brought another son, and they said to him, "Worship the idol." He said to them, "I cannot do so, as it is written in the Torah, you shall not bow down to any other god." Also from Exodus. And so they took him out and killed him. And they brought in yet another son and said to him, "Worship the idol." You can see what's going to happen here, right? He said to them, "I cannot do so, as is written in the Torah, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad." So they took him out and he killed him. And they brought in another son and said to him, worship the idol. He said to them, I cannot do so. It is written in the Torah, know therefore this day, today, and consider it in your heart that the Lord, he is God in heaven above and upon the earth beneath. There is no other. So they took him out and killed him. So each time they quote the Bible to the emperor, tell him, I'm not going to do it now. They then brought out another son, and they said to him, worship this idol. And he said to them, I cannot do so. It is written in the Torah, you have avouched the Lord this day to be your God, and the Lord has avouched you this day to be a people for his own possession. And that's also from Deuteronomy, like the last couple. We already took an oath to the Holy One, blessed be he, that we will not exchange him for a different God. And he too has taken an oath to us that he will not exchange us for another nation. All right, you know where we're up to now. Now it was the youngest brother who had said this, and the emperor pitied him. Seeking a way to spare the boy's life, the emperor said to him, I will throw down my seal before you. Bend over and pick it up, so that people will say he has accepted the king's authority. Harmony, right? Just pretend. You don't have to really bow down. Pick down my seal. The boy said to him, woe, Haval, to you, Caesar. Woe to you, Caesar. If you think that for the sake of your honor, I should fulfill your command to do this, and for the sake of the honor of the Holy One, blessed be he, all the more so shall I fulfill his command. He said, no, I will not pretend. I won't even pretend. As they were taking him out to be killed, his mother said to them, to the Romans, give him to me so that I may give him a kiss. She said to him, my son, go and say to your father Abraham, you bound one son on the altar, but I bound 7 sons. She too in the end went up to the roof and fell and died. A divine voice emerged and said, a joyful mother of children, from Psalms, as she raised her children to be devoted to the service of God. Now, the story is definitely a story of martyrdom. There's no question. It's maybe the most famous story besides Akiva's. I'd say probably Akiva, Hanina ben Teradion, and then Hannah and her 7 sons. Those are the most famous stories in Judaism of the Bible. I mean, of martyrdom, quoting the Bible and understanding how important it is. But this is also a story of suicide because the woman committed suicide. It's clear she committed suicide. We saw it last week with the executioner who threw himself on Hanina ben Teradion's pyre. He committed suicide. Now, there's no question the martyrs go to heaven. What's interesting is that there are people who are so close in proximity to this that in an act of, again, association, that they can get taken up into heaven. The assumption here is the mother she's celebrated in heaven. She's celebrated throughout time. Doesn't say she had to commit suicide. Doesn't say that. It doesn't say it. Now, you can understand the problem here from the standpoint of, but suicide's against Jewish tradition. But you can also understand from the standpoint of a parent who just lost 7 children. What do you do? What do you do? What do you do if you're a parent? Folks, this isn't speculation. This isn't an exercise in theoretical what ifs. This happened last week. So this is not a theoretical issue anymore, my friends, because of what we've been dealing with over the last 523 days. And so I'm going to share with you something, again, why this is not only not theoretical and why it's not only an issue of important to understand from a historical standpoint of what we've dealt with throughout our lives, but this is we have a tradition in Judaism that when someone dies the way these people die, these sons died, the way Rabbi Akiva died, and all the other rabbis that we read about, the way Lilianas and Papas died, that we have a tradition that what we're allowed to say in those situations, or what we maybe are supposed to say in these situations. Let me ask you a question first of all, before I tell you this thing. What do we say when someone dies in Hebrew? What's the tradition we say when someone dies? When someone in your family dies, when you hear somebody dies, when you put on a tombstone, what do you put? You put, "May their soul be bound up in the bonds of eternal life." When you see those Hebrew letters on the tomb, right? Every Jewish headstone used to have that Taf Nun Tzadi Bet Hey, right? People always ask me, what does that stand for? May her soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. And what do we say also when we talk about someone who died? Right? The tradition of what we say, Olav Shalom, right? Olav Shalom means that may they rest in peace. Olav Shalom. We say that. We also say Zikrono Livracha, right? May their memory be a blessing. That's what we're supposed to say when someone dies. Now, we used to actually, and even in the Orthodox world to this day, right? We have a tradition of reserving the Zikrono Livracha for someone who died, who was a tzaddik, was a rabbi or someone who was righteous. We're supposed to save that. Otherwise, we say, may they rest in peace. Today, everyone says Zikrono Livracha. But we have something else that we say when someone dies, like these guys. We don't say Olav Shalom. We don't say Zichrono Livracha. We can. But we have another thing that we say, my friends, and that's this. You heard it. You heard it in the Talmud, and I asked you to remember it. Right? May God avenge his blood. Right? It's this that you'll see on there. Het Yud Daled. May God avenge. This is what you'll see on a tombstone. Right? May God avenge his blood. Now, there's an interesting discussion that happened in Israel over these last days. If someone was killed in terrorism in Israel, in a terrorist attack, in a bomb, You're allowed to put on their tomb. I would say some people would say you're obligated to put on their tomb. May God avenge her blood, his blood. Right? Now, Israel never allowed soldiers to put that on their tombstone. Interesting, right? They couldn't put it on their tombstone. Couldn't put it on a soldier's tombstone. This is not a theoretical, historical question, my friends. This is why when I thought about doing this, I never thought about this. Folks, this happened less than a year ago. And now families can put, may God avenge his blood on the tombstone. Interesting, right? The expression was used. This is Jerusalem Post. This I didn't say this. This is a known fact. I mean, like, it was used for people who were killed for being Jewish. But military, I mean, soldiers, people who were killed and buried in Har Herzl, for example, were not allowed to put that on their tombstone. What was interesting is from the standpoint of when Israel was established in 1948, there was this interesting discussion that must have happened at the highest ranks of Israel's military and its the rabbinic authorities that work with the military, who got into a discussion of whether soldiers can put that there. Because if a soldier is in combat, to some extent, there's this understanding that that's their job. It's really interesting. This was never an issue, folks, because up until 1948, no Jew was ever killed in combat because Jews weren't allowed to have weapons. They didn't have an army. That was just didn't happen. But now there was this interesting question of whether, if a Jew is killed in combat, are they really victims of terror? And what's so interesting is that because of what happened on October 7th, and the fact that what was obvious to everyone is this wasn't when Israel was fighting Egypt, or Jordan or Syria in the 6-Day War and the Yom Kippur War with tanks, where the soldiers were being engaged as soldiers did in combat for, unfortunately, since the beginning of human history. There was a war. People were getting killed. It was horrible. But when soldiers were brutally, what happened on October 7th to the soldiers who were there, and for those who went there with me and saw what happened in these places, this was not a battle. No one was being kept. There was no soldier that was going to surrender. This was not a war. They were victims of terror the same as everybody else that day. And so the understanding, the discussion was, well, why should somebody who happened to be wearing a uniform that day not be able to have something that the person who wasn't wearing a uniform had that day when they were also brutally massacred? With no chance of surrendering. So the Israeli military said, we have a problem. We can't ethically justify not having those words being put on there. So this is not some theoretical question. This is not just a Talmudic discussion. This is not history. This is being played out right now. And I think what it tells us is that, number one, something different is happening now, even in regards to the Israeli military. And also, something's happened differently, obviously, in the last 77 years, which is that Jews do have an issue now where maybe sometimes we're defending ourselves. Maybe sometimes, again, we're fighting in a war. fighting a war with somebody that we might be friends with one day, or not friends with, but at least, have a cold peace with, like the Egyptians. But if people are going to murder you without any sense of like there's a war with objectives in it, it's not a war anymore. Not a war by any stretch of the imagination or any stretch of like what we can call a war. And so therefore we have to use these terms for terrorism and for violence and the terms we use for martyrs. So this is uh, this is what we're dealing with today, right now. The fact that there is a very, very fine line between martyrdom and what's happening in Israel at this very moment, or maybe not at this very moment, but what could happen tomorrow if the ceasefire ends. So it's up to the families. The soldiers don't have to put that on their tombstone. Absolutely, they don't. And I have a feeling that most soldiers are not going to opt to have that on their tombstone. But if they want to, they can now. And this was just what they had to do. So yeah, this one family that they focused on, the Yudkin family, they decided to leave the. They didn't put anything on because they wanted to put that on, and they let the discussion happen before they decided before they put it on. So now they'll put it on, assumedly. Um, so and there's the picture, my friends, of the newest area on Mount Herzl for the newest soldiers that were murdered and died and gave their lives because they were Jewish and because they were um, defending Israel. So the last time we were there in 2023, that area was uh, just a field. Now they're 1,000 soldiers that are now laying in Har Herzl that weren't there when when we were there, 2 years ago in February. So that is again. I wish I could end on a happy note, other than the fact that at least we have an army now, and at least we have the ability to defend ourselves and not wait just for God to avenge our dead. But and tomorrow we celebrate the fact that Jews do defend themselves, and they don't wait for an Esther and a Mordecai to lobby for them. We we will take matters into our own hands when it comes to defending ourselves and stopping the modern day Hamans. So that's the good news, friends. The sad fact is that they're still trying to kill us, and that is still a burden that we have. So yeah, let's hope there won't be more martyrs this next year. Let's hope that Purim will go back to being a time where we don't think just of the modern day, the current wars that we're in, and think about it more from a historical standpoint. But right now, this isn't history. This is the news. So, yeah, yeah, it's against Jewish. It's well, listen, the law in the Torah, it's not specified. I did not want to turn I did not want to turn this discussion of martyrdom into a discussion of suicide. It is an interesting discussion to have, and it's maybe one that we'll have down the road when we get to some other specific subjects, because it definitely leads into that. It bleeds into the question of suicide. It's interesting because we've been told that suicide goes against Jewish tradition, which it does. I mean, there's no question. Judaism celebrates life, but there's clearly points in time. There's clearly specific events where it seems as though suicide that's at least somewhat connected to martyrdom, where the young people who chose suicide um, um, they committed suicide like they did in Masada. Well, again, it's a very great. It's a But we will talk about it. Remember, the way that they got around it at Masada, the reason that they even had to do this at Masada was because of the Jewish prohibition of suicide. Because the people at Masada were so worried that if they committed suicide, that they would go to hell, essentially, if they did it, they killed each other. Look, if everybody at Masada, or at least the men at Masada, believed that they could have just committed suicide, they would have cut their own throats. But they didn't. They didn't. They left it to one person to commit suicide. The last person had to commit suicide. They had to take that risk. Everybody else killed somebody else. Everybody else. The people killed their families. Then they had their friend kill them, and then that friend killed their families, and then again, the lot went to the last, whoever the last person was, they had to kill themselves. But otherwise, they would not have drawn lots. They just would have killed themselves, and that would have been it. But the fact that Josephus says it, and then we found the actual potsherds, tells us that it was serious, and it was only serious because suicide was so against Jewish law. But yeah, since you brought it up, and since it is an important issue, and it's one that, gosh, man, it's a tough one to talk about, but every family, unfortunately, has been touched by suicide. It is one that we will probably get into at some point, but this definitely is where you talk about it. And the woman who kills herself after her 7 sons die doesn't say she was going to be killed. It's, it kind of says that this is the grief of what had she just witnessed. She went up to the top of the roof and threw herself off the roof. And we talked about it. Achitophel kills himself in the story of David, and there's not really a judgment about it. Samson killed himself. Now again, he killed himself while he killed all the Philistines too. But the assumption is that was an act of heroism by doing that. So the Bible has stories of people committing suicide where they're not acting out of I mean, you can say they're not being, it's not selfish, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but it's a gray area, and this area of martyrdom is where it becomes most obvious. So I actually read a book years ago, and I actually looked at it again before we came into today. If you want to read more about the comparison between Judaism and Christianity and Greek, remember the Greeks believed in noble suicide, right? Obviously, we all know about the Japanese, but in the cultures that we encountered, the Greeks were also, and the Romans for that matter, because they took a lot from the Greeks. The Jews knew about it, and by the time of the Romans, they knew about it. And this is a book that I read years ago and consulted again, in the last few days before we talk tonight. This is a book called A Noble Death: Suicide and Martyrdom Among Christians and Jews in Antiquity. So it was written, I didn't realize it was 30 years old, 33 years old, but it's really still kind of the book. But it has not only Jewish and Christian stuff, but it also has the very famous story of Socrates, who commit suicide, but he didn't really have a choice. He was given the option of committing suicide, which is another thing that the Romans would do to their leaders, is sometimes say, "Would you like to go home and commit suicide?" So that was a very Greco-Roman thing to do. Jews didn't usually do that. They killed people, or they didn't give them a choice. You can kill yourself. So yeah, we usually didn't do that, but not a really happy text today, but very important to, as we read about the rabbis and we read about their stories. So many of them were martyred that we kind of have to have the context of what it means and how these people, did what, lived and died the way they did. So everybody cool? I'm sorry to have to share that with you, but that was life and death, unfortunately, in the ancient. So, like I said, let's be happy that for the most part We don't have to live like that, though. Again, as we said, unfortunately, some of them, some of it was not good. All right, folks. Happy Purim. We do not have class next week, as I mentioned, because we'll be in England for the next week, but we'll be back. And we have services next Friday in person. And Congressman George Whitesides will be coming. He has to come and say hi to us all. So we're going to give him a chance just to say hello and introduce himself. Yeah, yeah. I thought it was really nice. I mean, I didn't get to see him at the Hanukkah thing. What? Yeah, of course, man. I'm gonna be here for my Friday night. I can't go along that. All right, sir. All right. Take care, everybody. We'll see you soon. And Hag Sameach. Bye, everybody. Hag Sameach.